statement of first principles. Reference has been made to the national interest. For us, the interests that we care about are the interests of working class people. And when we say working class people, we mean the interests of working class people here in the Republic, the interests of working class people in Northern Ireland, both Catholic and Protestant, the interests of working class people in England, Scotland, Wales, and the interests of working class people right across the European Union. So we will judge this agreement on how well it serves the interests of working class people, or otherwise, as the case may be. So for us, the key questions are: will this agreement guarantee jobs? Will this agreement guarantee living standards? Will it guarantee peace? Will it serve to heal sectarian division, or will it serve to exacerbate it? Apart from the last speaker, not a single deputy has made reference yet to the fact that the politics of neoliberalism run through this document like the stitching on a jacket. To focus on just one example, the question of state intervention. Article 16 of Annex 4 on page 373 states, "The Union and the UK acknowledge that anti-competitive business practice and state intervention have the potential to distort the proper functioning of markets and undermine the benefits of trade liberalisation." Pages 465 to 69 make reference to limiting state aid for postal services, broadband, railways, airports, etc. We hear much talk of division in the British Conservative Party. We hear much talk of government instability, and we hear much talk of a UK general election. At the Taoiseach, Mrs May and the EU negotiators are all no doubt aware that the likely winner of that election is Mr Corbyn. Nor, no doubt, are they blind to the fact that Mr Corbyn has pledged to reverse many of the privatisations put in place by British governments going back to the time of Mrs Thatcher. He has pledged to reverse rail privatisation. He has pledged to reverse water privatisation. He has pledged to renationalise the mail. State aid has been pledged to help build 1 million new homes. How many of these would be permitted under this deal? None of this would be permitted under this deal. If this deal is a deal for Brexit, it's clearly a deal for a Tory Brexit. Pro-market, pro-privatisation and pro-the rich. Anti-nationalisation, anti-public services and anti-the interests of working class people. And this is not a surprise when you look at who was at the talks. The Tory government and the top EU officialdom both represent the interests of, in the last analysis, big business elites. Nobody in these negotiations represented the interests of working class people. And the interests of working class people need to be represented now. The Minister for Finance says that a hard Brexit could cost 40,000 jobs. The ESRI say that wage cuts could be in the 5 to 10% range for workers in agri-food, tourism and manufacturing. The ESRI, the Nevin Economic Research Institute and the Department of Housing all agree that Brexit will mean more rent rises in the big cities. In Northern Ireland, Bombardier welcomed the deal and then announced the destruction of 500 jobs, 10% of their Northern Ireland workforce. Now, there's been much talk of red lines having been laid down by the various parties engaged in the negotiations to date. It's time for the organised working class movement to lay down its red lines in relation to the issues. No to job losses, no to wage cuts, no to cuts in services or an exacerbation of the housing crisis, and an important point, no to sectarian division, a point that I'll come back to in a moment. The bosses should be put on notice that any and all attempts to attack our jobs, our pay and our conditions will meet with real resistance, no holds barred. We are calling for the convening of an emergency conference with the widest possible participation of workers' representatives from workplaces across the entire island of Ireland, north and south, and alongside trade unionists from Britain too. Such a conference should host a full and a democratic discussion on how best now to defend and fight for the interests of working people and the communities that we come from. Our hope is that the Irish Congress of Trade Unions would take responsibility for the convening of such a conference. But should the Congress decide not to take such a step, our hope would be that a coalition of the trade union bodies prepared to do so would do so. The trade union movement represents 800,000 members in Ireland, including 200,000 members in the north of Ireland. The trade union movement has more than 6 million members in Britain. It has the potential to be a powerful force intervening into this situation. Such a conference should dispel the myth, and it is a myth, that workers' rights have been handed down by a benevolent European Union. This turns reality on its head. The European Union has been central to waging a war on workers, particularly given its role in Troika austerity programmes, as we've experienced in this country. Of course, they did it alongside right-wing governments like the Irish government. So who has really fought for workers' rights, and how are they really won? This year marks the 50th anniversary of the Ford strike in Dagenham, which forced the Labour government to concede the Equal Pay Act. The incredibly strong strike of 8,500 council workers in Glasgow recently, which the BBC described as one of the biggest ever strikes in the UK on the issue of equal pay, is testament to the fact that these rights are won through struggle. The trade union movement must reject the false choice of this deal versus the UK walking out of the EU. In the words of Len McCluskey, the General Secretary of Unite, Unite utterly opposes the false choice of a bad deal versus no deal. That should be the position of the movement as a whole. There's another reason why the trade union movement should reject false choices on this issue. Both this deal and the UK crashing out of the EU with no deal contain within themselves the potential for sectarian polarisation in Northern Ireland. This deal provides for extra non-customs checks on some types of goods passing between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK in certain circumstances in approximately 2 years' time. In other words, an east-west border could begin to emerge as early as December 2020. That's not even to mention the question of a north-south border, which I'll return to later. In that sense, this deal will add to the insecurities felt about the future by many ordinary Protestants. If there's a perception over time that their identity is being diminished, it could provoke a serious reaction, as we've seen in the past. The real issue here is not the DUP. The real issue is the concerns and fears of ordinary working-class Protestant people. And by the way, just on that, is there any chance that we could see those concerns being dealt with in a more serious and sensitive way in the media here, rather than the kind of patronising portrayals that we see so often? That would be a step forward. Now, even if the parliamentary arithmetic had been different after the last general election and there had been no DUP-Tory deal, the opposition of Northern Ireland Protestants to any perception of an east-west border being created would still be a factor to be weighed. Equally and conversely, if on the basis of this deal being rejected now and a move towards a hard border, there is the potential for a strong reaction from the Catholic community. Border posts, custom posts, any physical manifestation of a hard border would become symbols of a denial of the national aspirations of the Catholic population and would not be accepted in any way. Not only would it not be accepted, it would be opposed in a vocal and a very active way. Trade unions, which unite people across the sectarian divide, should take action against any moves which would harden the border or raise the prospects of a new east-west border in the Irish Sea. When our colleagues in People Before Profit state, as they do in their amendment, that the Brexit crisis must not be used as a pretext by employers or government to enforce wage restraint, etc., we can only agree with them. On the other hand, when our colleagues in PPP issue a call for a border poll in the same amendment, we must fundamentally disagree with them. A border poll does not offer any solution to resolving issues raised by the Brexit negotiations or resolving the issue of the national question in Ireland. The logic of a border poll is based on the mathematics of sectarianism. It either means a continued coercion of the Catholic population into the status quo, or a vote that would attempt to coerce the Protestant population into a state that it will refuse to accept. The campaign itself would be a sectarian headcount and would carry the risk of seriously ratcheting up sectarian tensions. The only solution to the problems of sectarianism is to build a powerful workers' movement that can challenge both unionism and nationalism with socialist policies, including through the creation of a new mass political party which represents working class people, both Catholic and Protestant. The real guarantors of peace in Northern Ireland are the working class people, Catholic and Protestant, who have been prepared to take to the streets to take action against the forces of sectarianism. The EU is not a guarantor of peace. Any idea that it is completely contradicted by the recent calls by Merkel and Macron for a European army and plans to ramp up European spending, as well as the militarisation contained in PESCO, which includes Irish government participation. Nor is the EU a guarantor of the rights of minorities. This was shown recently by EU support for the Spanish state in repressing the national aspirations and rights of people in Catalonia. A lot of misery, a lot of people who feel the system is failing them, a lot of people who feel that the system is really just there to punish them. These were the words last week of UN Rapporteur Philip Alston, talking about 14 million people who live in poverty in Tory Britain. It was this anger against the system which carried the Brexit vote. This anger has the power to rock the establishment once again by bringing down the crisis-ridden Tory government and bringing a Corbyn government to power. Socialists in Ireland would welcome the return of a Corbyn government. If such a government were to adopt a position of socialist opposition to the European Union, it would transform the situation. A Corbyn government should seek to reopen negotiations and demand an entirely different relationship with the EU, including new trade and custom arrangements based on the interests of working class people, not the 1%. Corbyn could speak over the heads of the Commission, reaching out to working class people across Europe in rejecting neoliberal rules, calling for coordinated action for green energy on a Europe-wide basis, and popularising a socialist vision for Europe. A left government would be able to call on workers throughout the continent to fight the race to the bottom in their own countries, mobilising against attempts by their own governments or the EU to pursue punitive measures against other workers in Britain, Ireland or elsewhere. The workers' movement in Ireland should mobilise its resources as part of a Europe-wide fight back. Socialists are in favour of a genuinely united Europe. This will only be possible with the socialist transformation of society, allowing the coming together of nations of Europe in a democratic, European-wide confederation. We fight for socialism in Ireland with full democratic rights for the Protestant community. We are in favour of a socialist federation of Ireland, Scotland, England and Wales in a free and voluntary federation and a socialist United States of Europe. I started by asking the question whether this agreement serves the interests of working class people. Our answer is that it does not, and for this reason we will vote against the government's proposal this evening. The real challenge now is for the working class movement to carve out a real, genuine alternative to this system and what it offers to people, and to put the interests of working people at the heart of building such an alternative.